Hi, welcome back to this Django tutorial series, and in this session we are going to be looking at data and model. I believe that you are familiar with the fundamentals of Django already, how to set it up and so on and so forth. We have a database, and each table of the database is actually called a model, and this model defines the data that you put to it. Now if you look at this diagram now, you can see frame model, you can see body model, you can see block model, and each of these model have their own columns like id, absolute magnitude and so on. This might look complex, but just to give you an overview of what data and model. So now the information that you now insert based on the structure that you have defined for this particular model is now what we call data. Now without too much discussion, we are going to be looking at it practically. Come to your desktop. What you just need to do is just create a new folder, call it data and model, or anything you feel can. So just like you know that our code editor has been Visual Studio Code, so just drag the folder to your Visual Studio Code and you are going to be having that. So you can then enlarge it, and yes, I trust. We then open our console. Just go to this place and open your new terminal. Now we have our terminal here. Be sure that you are in that folder, and by just pressing list. Now we don't have anything in the folder at the moment, so the first thing you should do is that you should create and activate your virtual environment. And to create your virtual environment, you might have installed virtual environment, but just to be sure, and just to be sure we're on the same page, just do pip install virtual environment. So this will install the virtual environment, and it's going to be a global installation, but you might have installed this, and if you have installed it, you can just skip that step. And since you have installed the virtual environment, the next thing for this folder now, you should now create a new virtual environment. And to create your virtual environment, just say python module venv, which is the virtual environment, and this next parameter now define the name you want to give to your virtual environment. But for simplicity's sake, I'll still go ahead and name it venv. You can decide to name your own my virtual environment or anything, but I just prefer to just name it VMV so that it's easy for me to relate to it. Now you can see now that you have your virtual environment in that folder. So now that we have our virtual environment in that folder, the next thing to do now is to start the virtual environment. And to start the virtual environment, you just go virtual environment still installing. Okay, now we have it here. So to start your virtual environment, you just say source v, the name you call your virtual environment, slash script slash activate So you can see now that you have your vmv above, which is to show you that you have been able to activate your virtual environment. So the next thing to do now is to install Django. Don't forget that we are looking at Django, and since you have install your virtual environment, you have started it, now there's a need for you to install Django on that virtual environment, because you don't want to install it globally, so that any changes or any modification you apply to Django in this folder structure or folder directory, it will not be applied to every section of your other Django application. So that's why we are installing it on a separate virtual environment. So we go pip install Django. So that will install Django for us, after which we are going to be creating our Django application. We are going to be creating our Django application, after which we then learn data and model, as this section of the tutorial is dedicated to data and model. So our Django is currently installing, so I'll then pause and come back to continue the tutorial. So now we have our Django installed already. So the next thing now is, since we have installed our Django on that virtual environment, there's a need for us to create our Django application. And to create your Django application, please make sure that your virtual environment is still on. So I'll just clean this. Now make sure that your virtual environment is still indicated here on top. So what you now need to do is you create your Django application. To create your Django application, you go the command Django, admin start project, and you go to your project name. So the project name, I decide to call it coding school. Let's just call it coding school. You can decide to name your project anything depending on what you are working on, but I will decide to name this our project coding school. And don't forget that after you have given your project a name, you should put a dot at the end of the name so that you will not have a subfolder and another subdirectory. So it's better you just go the dots and then press enter. So that will create your Django application. I can see now that we have our coding school application, which we have some parameters, and I believe that all these files have been explained to you in the previous sections. So we go to the next section now as we create our Django application. Now you have created your project, which is the coding school project. Now each project now have an application. So the next step now is we create our application, which is under the project. So it's just the way Django works. So now to create an application, you go create, you go Django, oh sorry, Python. You can decide to use Python, you can decide to use py, it's the same thing. So manage.py, and we say start app, and you give your application a name. Of course, for a coding school, you can expect to have assessment, you can expect to have student application, you can expect to have maybe authentication, and so on and so forth. But just for this data and model section of the tutorial, let's just focus on managing students so that we'll be able to relate with, okay, how do we manage our student data, how do we manage our student model. So let's call our application name students, or maybe management student management. So that will be an application under coding school project. So another application can be like the assessment, as I've mentioned earlier. So now that we have created our application, you should not forget that you should register your application project, and under the settings you should then come to, okay, let me just come now under the settings of your project, because if you don't register the application, then anything you are doing will just be applied to the project. So for anything you are doing to be applied to the application, you need to make it Django realize that, okay, I've created this application, and you should consider it as part of any command that I'm running or anything I'm doing going forward. So to register the application, you come to this installed apps. This installed app, you just put it anywhere. Preferably you can put it as the first, and don't forget the name that we call it student management. All these are just what we have looked at before or previously, so but just to refresh our memory and get us on the same page with what we want to do in this session of the tutorial.